Hello, Journey family, and welcome to the final installment of Mark Uncut. My name is Matthew Anderson. I'm here with Professor Mike Leary, Professor of New Testament, and we are just going to dive right in. We're talking about the end of the Gospel of Mark, Mark 13 and following. Mike, first off, in Mark 13, Jesus talks about the destruction of the temple. Seems a little weird. What's going on there?
Yeah, Mark 13 comes as a bit of a surprise. It's the longest discourse unit in the Gospel of Mark.
Okay, discourse unit meaning?
Basically just means it's the longest extended conversation that Mark records from Jesus to his disciples. And
okay.
It encompasses the whole chapter, which signifies to us it's probably really important information in
right.
some respect, which is offset by its oddity because he brings in a lot of these strange images, the destruction of the temple, this figure of the Son of Man, the abomination of desolation, a lot of things that are difficult for us to really understand. Even perhaps for first century readers, this chapter was a bit out of their scope.
Yeah, it sounds a little bit crazy when you say the abomination of desolation.
Yeah, well, let's track through the chapter.
Okay, go for it.
Because there is a pretty legitimate line of logic here that's very important, not just in terms of understanding who Jesus is in the Gospel of Mark, but it ties together some interesting loose ends in the narrative of Mark itself. And the first one really is, I think, that all throughout the Gospel of Mark, Jesus has been challenging his disciples' notion of greatness. They understand who Messiah is in the Old Testament. They understand the sort of political and economic status that comes with being associated with such a figure.
Right.
And Jesus is constantly challenging them and recasting their expectations in terms of service.
Okay.
And helping them understand that if they're really going to be followers of Jesus, they're going to be servers and sufferers like Jesus.
Right, and we see him sort of welcoming the little children a couple chapters earlier.
That's right.
It's sort of saying, like, it's not necessarily political authority, etc. It's something that's the opposite of that, maybe.
Something far more significant.
Right.
And at the end of chapter 12, right before this, we have that wonderful, charming little, very Markan story of the widow's mite, where there's a lot of hidden glory in this small offering that she has to present, and Jesus provides this image to challenge their notion of greatness yet again,
okay.
which then spills us directly into chapter 13,
yeah.
in which we have this, it's almost an image of tourism. So Jesus and his followers are walking around Jerusalem, they're looking at all the buildings, and the architecture in Jerusalem in this age, which would have been full of this beautiful Herodian architecture.
Okay.
He brought to Jerusalem a measure of grandeur that the city hadn't seen for a long time.
And he is their Herod, right?
That's
who
right.
was ruling over that area when Jesus was born.
That's correct.
Okay, just wanted to clarify that.
And the remainders of his family as well. So it's a bit like being downtown Chicago for the first time. And you're seeing these very large buildings. These are guys from Galilee. This is not the stuff that they saw every day, and they were a bit agog at how glorious it really looked. And so they look up to Jesus and say, look, teacher, look at what wonderful stones and what wonderful buildings. And then out of the blue, Jesus says, well, one day all these are going to be knocked down.
Right.
Now, it's one thing just to say that all these great buildings are going to be knocked down, you know.
Right.
But he's also looking at the temple and saying this.
Right.
Now, to look at a Jew and say, oh, you see your temple here? Well, one day that's going to be destroyed. That's very significant because the temple really was the heart of what it meant to be a Jew and the heart of what it meant to worship as a Jew. It was all centered there in the temple, which signified to them God's presence. So in essence, Jesus was saying, this is going to be deleted from your religious experience as a Jew. All this is going to cease to exist. The very means by which you communicate with God and are forgiven by God someday is going to be destroyed. For Jesus to say that is it's a very controversial statement. It actually might be one of the most controversial statements he could have made in that context.
Okay, so it's controversial because for the Jews, the temple is the center of their religious life. It's controversial because he's essentially saying, you know, something better is here, some sort of abrogation has come, some sort of ending of this time period has arrived.
And that's what the rest of chapter 13 is about, really, because the disciples are puzzled, and as chapter 13 goes on, we see that they're in a different location on the Mount of Olives, which is opposite the temple, and they're sitting together, they're in private, and the disciples say, okay, so back to that temple thing that you said, when is that going to happen? Because for them, that's a big deal. They'd like to know, is that going to be something that's in our immediate future? Is this something that maybe you're going to be part of? They want more information.
Right.
And Jesus doesn't really give it to them. What Jesus does in response to the question about when is the temple going to be destroyed, he starts talking about the end of the world. And for the rest of the chapter in Mark 13 here, we have Jesus really going back through Old Testament prophecy about the end of the world and linking it to the destruction of the temple and saying, you need to look for this. You need to be prepared for wars and rumors of wars, and for this terrible era which even family units will break down, and brother will be against brother, and there'll be false prophets, and people's hearts and minds will be led astray by terrible religious deceit.
Right, so I hear all this, and I'm immediately thinking charts and graphs, and the end of the world is coming and whatnot, and we're all sort of going to be sort of the thief in the night, that's coming. Right. We're going to be left behind, the famous news series. We don't have to get too far into this, but what's significant, what's theologically significant about Jesus' answer within the context of the Gospel of Mark?
What's theologically significant, I'm glad you framed it this way, because I grew up with all those charts and graphs and all these books declaring
I wish we'd all been ready.
And talking about the abomination of desolation, which really is just an image of a terrible sacrilege that occurs in the temple that's so bad that it actually soils the purpose of the temple as a place where people can authentically worship God and offer pure sacrifices. But without getting into the chart and graph thing, the theological importance is this. The disciples and Jesus' followers are about to see something really terrible happen to Jesus, something horrific. He's going to be torn apart by the crowds. He's going to be nailed to a tree in a very shameful form of death. But in Mark 13, Jesus is teaching his disciples that what they're about to see is not the end of the story of Jesus, that in reality, it's the center of it.
Okay.
It's the middle of it. And the end of the story involves his return, the return of this figure, the Son of Man, this glorious figure that comes to rescue God's remnant, the faithful, and to judge those who really need to be judged.
Right.
And his followers don't know this yet, but they're about to be able to take a lot of comfort in that because they're about to be persecuted and reviled, just like Jesus was. But now they'll always have Mark 13, an image that this is just the middle of the story. And that every time we feel out of control, every time we feel disillusioned, remember this image of the Son of Man, coming in glory, which is an image of the control that God has over history. And not just the control, but that God has a purpose for history, which is a revelation of his glory. And they're about to see the middle of that story, Jesus hung up on the cross.
So, Mike, that's a great overview of chapter 13. When it comes to chapter 14, obviously it seems like it's a sort of bridge chapter, almost a filler. Jesus, there's a lot of different stories that goes on. What should we make of what happens in this 14th chapter?
It is a bridge chapter, but it's an important chapter because we have to remember that when we're reading the Gospels, we're not reading theological treatises. We're reading the story of what happened to Jesus and the story of what happened to people around Jesus.
Okay.
And in chapter 14, we get really good glimpses into what was happening around Jesus right immediately before the whole trial and crucifixion process occurs. And the very first person that we meet in chapter 14 is this woman in Bethany. And she anoints Jesus with very costly perfume or oil. And in chapter 5, it says this ointment could have been sold for more than 300 denarii and given to the poor.
Right.
A sizable amount of cash. And he scolded her. But Jesus said, "Leave her alone. Why do you trouble her? She has done a beautiful thing to me. For you always have the poor with you, and whenever you want, you can do good for them. But you will not always have me. She has done what she could. She has anointed my body beforehand for burial." And this is really interesting. And truly, I say to you, wherever the gospel is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will be told in memory of her. I don't know about you, but every time I've shared the gospel, I haven't told her story.
Right.
But there's a sense in which we do. And what's important here is that when it comes to Jesus, when it comes to understanding Jesus and valuing Jesus, some things are worth doing for no reason at all.
Okay.
And that what we learn from this woman is a proper way to interface with the glory of Christ.
Okay.
And that is to celebrate it. When you're in its presence, to give what you have to it.
Right.
For no reason. It doesn't have to have an agenda. It doesn't have to have a political purpose or a social purpose. Not all the time.
We can just sort of do it because we're sort of overflowing with joy and gratitude.
That's right. And that really is the gospel, that we can celebrate the presence of Christ. And that the presence of Christ is available to us. It's not far from us. It's near us. And like her, here he is, right in front of her.
Right.
Her last chance. And she seems to understand a bit of what's going to happen to Jesus, and thus anoints him as if she's putting him into a grave.
She's got a very good sense of timing, dramatic timing.
That's
almost.
right.
So what are some of the other characters that we meet? Are there any other sort of folks?
It's in chapter 14 where the story of Judas begins to unfold.
Okay.
And really the story of Judas and Mark occurs, in distinction to what's just happened here in Bethany with this woman who understands who he is and gives all to him for absolutely no reason, whereas Judas is busy behind the scenes figuring out how he can capitalize off of turning Jesus over to the authorities.
Judas is, of course, the most infamous, which does not mean more than famous. It actually means bad of the disciples.
That's right, and bad in a very specific way. So Mark is all about coming to know who Jesus is, really understanding who Jesus is. And Judas, for Mark, is an icon of someone who doesn't get it.
Right.
Judas never really got who Jesus was. We're really harsh on Judas because we thought he was greedy or he saw an opportunity, he took it. Judas' fundamental failing was that he had all the opportunity available to him to know and understand the significance of Jesus and what greatness really means. And he abandoned that opportunity. He just didn't get it.
Okay.
And then that brings us to Peter, of course.
Oh, yes.
Where we have the denial of Peter foretold, which will take place then later on in his story of what happens, later on in chapter 14. And he's really the third great character in this chapter. And by the time the reader gets to chapter 14, they know who Peter is, they're familiar with how impetuous he is, and how even though sometimes he might be a bit too bold or overstep his bounds, Peter does get it. And in fact, he's one of the first disciples to really get it, a distinction.
Yeah, we saw that just before the Transfiguration when he says, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God."
That's right.
Jesus says, "Blessed are you."
Which is the center of Mark's gospel.
Right.
That's right, in a narrative way.
Right.
But here we have this idea that Peter is going to be one who directly denies Jesus, denies his familiarity and association with Jesus, which he does at the end of the chapter. So for the reader who's not familiar with all these characters or reading it for the first time, this is a really harrowing moment. You get to the end of chapter 14, right before we start into the story about the trial and crucifixion, and here's Peter denying Jesus. So the question is, who's going to follow this guy? He's about to be turned over to the crowds, die this horrific, socially shameful death. If even Peter's not going to stand with Jesus and continue to believe and understand who he is, then who will?
Right.
It's a very harrowing, suspenseful moment in the gospel.
That's interesting. So let's transition, if that's all right, to the death of Christ.
Yes.
What would be significant, or what's the meaning of the death of Christ, particularly in the Gospel of Mark? Like, what does Mark make of it?
Yeah, that seems like an odd question because it's the gospel, right?
Right.
Fairly standard.
He dies for our
universal.
sins.
Yeah,
to not say that flippantly, I mean, he does.
We know
that.
the little message. Yeah.
Right.
But the reality is, each gospel author does bring a different perspective to what Jesus' death means and what sort of effect it has, not just on the gospel authors personally, but the echoes that will take and the shape that will take in the church later. So each gospel really does have a different answer to that question.
Okay.
And Mark, in this chapter, the way that he narrates the death of Christ, you can see it pretty clearly. And it goes like this. In chapter 15, you have 3 events and 3 responses.
Right.
The first event is Jesus' trial.
Yeah.
And during Jesus' trial, there's a very unjust kangaroo court process by which the Sanhedrin decides he's guilty of what? They don't really know, but Jesus eventually does say, "I am the Son of Man."
Right.
And that's enough for them. Jesus kind of shot himself in the foot.
To put it
from that perspective.
one way.
Yes. And that's how Mark really kind of poses it here.
Right.
So there's that event, and then the soldiers mock him, right?
Right.
So then second event is Pilate turns Jesus over to the crowds, and then the crowds mock him. The third event is Jesus dies. And what happens? Well, there's this little image we have from Mark after Jesus dies of a centurion standing next to the cross who can see the temple, and he can see the curtain in the temple.
Right.
And as Jesus expires, as he gives up his last breath, the temple curtain, the veil tears in two from top to bottom.
And the significance of the temple, the veil tearing.
Signifying that the temple used to be the way we accessed God and God's forgiveness.
Okay.
But now that veil has been split in two. We no longer need a high priest taken from men. They have to go in there and do it for us.
This is similar to the destruction of the temple imagery. In one sense, it comes close to it. It's almost a foreshadowing. Is that fair, or you can say no to that?
No, it is. There is a connection there.
Okay.
But as far as Mark's concerned, what is Mark's gospel? What does the death of Jesus mean in Mark? It comes from the centurion's response. So this is the third event. Third response, the centurion says, truly this man was the Son of God. That's Mark's gospel. That's the meaning of the death of Jesus in Mark, is that Jesus came to serve and give his life as a ransom for many, which is Mark's very simple statement of salvation in Mark. But that the death of Jesus is a means for people to really recognize what occurred, what it took.
Yeah, so let me ask you about this, because I think a lot of us, me included, for years, when we've asked, when we've been asked, how do we know that Jesus is God, we point to the resurrection, right? And we say, well, he rose again from the dead. Now, clearly that's true. That's one way. But what you're saying is well, Mark presents the recognition of the Son of God, the recognition of Jesus as who he says he was in the death of Christ.
That's exactly right. And more interestingly, it comes from the mouth of a centurion, not a Jew, not a learned priest, not someone who is familiar with the great history of Old Testament prophecy, which talks about Messiah, but a centurion who probably knew little about this whole religious controversy that was going on. But he recognized in the process of Jesus' death the attitude towards which Jesus went to the cross and the terrible injustice by which that occurred. In that, he recognized something glorious.
Okay, so to fill out the context of the Gospel of Mark, I mean, this is being written to Christians who are experiencing persecution, particularly at the hands of the Roman Empire, as represented by a Roman centurion. So is there something here about a sort of, go forth and you can make it type message that in your suffering you are sort of at the hands of the Roman Empire? Even the Romans will say, we'll be able to recognize the glory of the gospel as Christians continue to suffer like Jesus did.
That's exactly right. That the imitation of Christ is not something that we do just because we have nothing else to do until he returns, but that the imitation of Christ really is what we're called to be, called to do. That's how the gospel itself is borne out in the world. By us estimating the value of Jesus and then understanding his concept of greatness and then employing that in whatever context that we find ourselves.
So Mike, let's turn to the very end of the Gospel of Mark. Chapter 16. What's going on here?
Yeah, chapter 16 is a tough chapter. It's one of the most controversial and ignored chapters in the New Testament. There's so much going on, actually, that a lot of New Testament scholarship just kind of ignores it and moves on. Like you see the car wreck and you keep going. Don't want to get involved. But
we will not avoid the car wreck. We're going for it.
And that's too bad, because there is a lot of good information here. And it actually is a very fitting end to Mark's gospel. So we've had the very harrowing depiction of Jesus' death, crucifixion, and Mark really draws all the injustice that was part of that process out into the narrative. Chapter 16, verse 1 it's a respite. It's a breath of fresh air, because it takes us back to the tomb in the garden. It's a cool morning, and these followers of Jesus, these several women, come to complete the burial process by anointing Jesus with various things. They get there, though, and the stone door of the tomb has been rolled away, and upon it is seated an angelic figure who looks at them and says, he's not here any longer. He's risen. He's gone ahead before you in Galilee. And then what happens is Mark pens verse 8, which in many editions of the New Testament, which we'll talk about, is the final verse of Mark's gospel. And it says, they went out and fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. So According to Mark, at least, the first human response to the resurrection was fear.
Right.
Or uncertainty, timidity. They had no idea really what was going on, but really they were afraid, which is a very interesting thing to say, and it's unexpected, again, which
right.
is characteristic for Mark. The other Gospels really relish the moment where they get to proclaim the resurrection of Jesus and tell stories about how Jesus appeared to his many other disciples. But Mark doesn't do that. He leaves us with this image of these women who really are quite afraid. They're not quite certain what's going on.
Right, and that's very odd because, for instance, when we celebrate Easter, I mean, Easter is a time of immense rejoicing for us. It's a time of just glorious sort of raising up of hymns and psalms and spiritual songs and joy upon great joy. And we don't often think about the resurrection as inducing fear.
We don't, but we need to talk about this because I think what really is happening here at the end of the Gospel of Mark is a charter for realistic Christianity.
Okay.
I grew up in a very triumphalist Christianity, a Christianity in which the Christian life was depicted as just victory.
Right.
And any sort of personal failure or any confession of fear or uncertainty was seen as a form of weakness.
Okay.
So we didn't share those kinds of things. But that really contradicts the image we have here at the end of the Gospel of Mark, where we have these women encountering the resurrection of Christ, but yet they're uncertain.
Right.
And I think it's important for us to understand that this is an important element of the experience of the risen Christ. This uncertainty, this ability, even invitation to wonder and question. But we can now, by virtue of the gospel, by virtue of living out Jesus' narrative, living with Jesus, we can question and wonder and have these fears within an atmosphere of security and grace.
So you've talked throughout, you've mentioned this phrase a couple times, and I love it. I think it's great. The hidden glory of Mark's gospel. And here it seems like you couldn't make the glory any more hidden. In fact, it's utterly gone. It seems just
completely absent.
Completely absent.
Yes.
But it seems like, and correct me if I'm wrong, is one of the things that Mark is trying to do is to get us as readers to see the places where there's glory, even when it seems like it's not there.
That's right. And really, at those times in my Christian life where I feel a bit lost, or I have some difficult questions, I really do try to come back here with these women to this tomb at the end of Mark and relive their uncertainty, relive their fear, because it's one that didn't last. Because as we know from the other Gospels, Jesus did appear to his disciples in these really rich and glorious and profound ways, which these women would have themselves experienced.
Right.
But we can return with them and live out this journey of rediscovering the glory of the resurrected Christ.
Well, that's very interesting. I think as we look at sort of Mark in particular and seeing the glory that's hidden here, what is it about the sort of lack of triumphalism, the sort of openness to fear? You mentioned that it's not the only aspect, right? And I think I just want to underscore that a little bit more, right? This is one part.
This is one part, yes. And it's important, I think it's important that we recognize this ending of Mark because he's writing as an early Christian. And this type of fear and uncertainty would have been a significant component of the earliest Christian experience. We have the benefit of hindsight, of men like Paul and great interpreters of the Bible. We can look back through the ages and understand what happened, really. They didn't. They didn't really get it. It took decades, really, to understand exactly what this resurrection meant.
And particularly Mark's audience, too, right? Persecuted,
That's
etc., is going to particularly resonate with this fear that they would have experienced.
That's exactly right. The persecuted church in Rome is experiencing firsthand that the gospel, the triumphant gospel, is not all it's cracked up to be.
Okay, so after that passage, I look in my Bible and I see this funny little inscription that doesn't seem like the rest of the text. And what it says is, some of the earliest manuscripts do not include chapter 16, verses 9 through 20. What's going on?
Well, all of our Bibles should include that because Mark 16, 9 through 20 actually aren't in the earliest manuscripts that we have. the earliest Greek and Latin manuscripts from which we translate the New Testament. It does appear later in the 2nd century that some important Christian writers and thinkers like Irenaeus, for example, would refer to it in his writing. So wherever verses 9 through 20 come from, they're early, but they're not part of the earliest manuscript. So textual critics have a difficult time explaining what's going on here.
Okay, so I'm a sort of normal Christian as I am, and I'm reading this and I think, and let's say I realize that this section isn't a part of the original sort of inerrant, authorized manuscripts and whatnot. What difference does it make to me as a reader?
I think it's really important to understand that all of our New Testament texts are the product of a process. And for a textual critic who's looking at all the evidence and trying to evaluate where exactly do verses 9 through 20 come from, should they be part of our translation of the New Testament? Some will say that Mark ends directly at verse 8.
Yeah.
Some will say that perhaps there were a few additional verses that got lost somehow. Early manuscripts made out of materials like parchment and papyrus, for example, the last leaves or the first leaves could become abraded, they could become worn down, and we could lose parts of those texts. Perhaps something like that happened here.
Right.
But I think it's important to recognize that this text gives us a window into the Christianity that produced it. So it's an important part of the development of Mark and the development of the Bible itself. It's a window into a pretty intriguing Christianity. But is it authoritative in the same way that the rest of Mark is, or that lost ending perhaps to Mark would have been if we still had it? I don't think so. Okay,
so I should read it then how? I mean, I clearly am invested and care about the earliest developments of Christianity, and I want to place myself in that tradition as much as possible, as we all do, and understand sort of where Christianity went in the early years. But you say it's significant. I mean, should I read it differently?
Yeah, the reality is that in these texts that are quite questionable about whether they're original parts of the New Testament or not, and this really is, there's a significant question here. And in most probability, it's not, really. So building doctrine out of it in the same way we'd build doctrine out of Mark chapter 15, or basing my Christian life on this text in the same way I would off of Mark 15. They're not the same thing, really. They don't carry the same inspirational or authoritative weight. So I think it's important to read and understand this text as part of the process by which we have the New Testament.
Right.
But would I build doctrine out of it? Probably not. And the reality is there are some pretty unique elements here in verses 9 through 20 that we should be wary of crediting with much authoritative significance for how we do church now.
Well, thanks so much, Mike, for joining me for Mark Uncut. Really appreciate your witness and your work and all the things that you have done to help us learn to read the Gospel of Mark better. We hope that you have enjoyed this series. If you'd like to see all of them, you can go to JesusAnd/Mark Uncut. If you have ideas for other things you'd like to hear about or things you'd like to learn, feel free to email me, Matthew Anderson, at manderson@journeyon.net, or you can put a comment there in the comments. I'd love to hear from you, and we do hope that you have learned to read your Bible better, particularly the Gospel of Mark through this series, and that most importantly, above even that, that you have trained your eyes to see the hidden glory, to see Jesus, and to know him better and love him more, which is clearly what we are all about here at The Journey. So thanks for your time and for your attention.